today we are going to discuss one of the topics a lot of us are on our mind. How do you lead teams in a difficult times? And join me today is Ryan Polk, who is actually on the board of Dragonboat. Ryan is the operating partner at Insight Partners, leading it's basically in-house CTO, CPO, and former he was the CPO at Carbon Black and CA Technologies, and running products like Rally Software, Clarity, and a number more. So with the experience on both sides, for the investor side and the CPO side, both sides of the table, Ryan, we couldn't find a better person to really share what does this role entail, what it takes to be a good CEO, and when he typically sees CEOs struggle, challenge, or thrive.
Well, so first of all, I'll do a little bit of I won't extend the introduction too much, but I will say I love this area. I love talking about how we build product organizations, R&D organizations, as I would say it. And this is kind of a fun session for me because I get to kind of walk through our methods and how we talk to our portfolio companies. What do I do here at Insight? Well, that's kind of the important part of this one. Insight has over 450 companies in our portfolio. I'm the operating partner here. I have a team of about 15 people that help advise our companies across the portfolio. One of the key areas of advising that we do is helping with hiring. We help hire CPOs, heads of product, CTOs, CPTOs, everything in the R&D area of the organization. Most likely, if you're talking to one of those 450 different companies about a CPO or head of product role, you're going to talk to me or somebody on my team as a part of that process. So you should really have the expectations set beforehand before you talk to me. And this is kind of what I'm going to do in this presentation. I was talking to Becky. We wanted to talk a little bit about, what are the expectations of the CPO and head of product roles, and then also talk about that in the context of what's going on in the market right now, which is those roles are being faced with challenges around not just building their portfolios, but also to some degree shrinking their portfolios of teams. And so we're going to talk about it in that context, but a lot of this conversation is really focused on what is the role of the CPO and what are our expectations when we talk to CPOs in the hiring process. I'm going to break my own slides. So let's start off a little bit here with this differentiation between head of product and CPO, chief product officer, not chief people officer. That's a whole nother presentation. But when we look at the head of product role and the chief product officer role, we make this distinction because we hire a lot of both, right? Typically, your head of product role is someone who facilitates the portfolio process, right? There's someone who is driving the process but doesn't necessarily own it. Typically, they join a company that has a strong CEO or a strong set of founders that don't want to fully let go of the portfolio management and the management of the actual product strategy overall. They need somebody to come in and help facilitate them through that process and drive ROI in the products through that facilitation, not ownership. Whereas the CPO role typically owns the product portfolio and is the person making the trade-offs. Now, of course, they really shouldn't lose that facilitative mindset, right? That mindset is key to bringing along the rest of the leaders inside of your organization, but they are the owner of that portfolio overall. It's the same core skills, though, underlying those. You need to understand how to manage your portfolio effectively, your portfolio of investments, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute. You need to have the strong mindset around execution and the ability to drive the strategy process in a facilitative manner in both of these roles. Overall, in both of these roles, the core skill set you need to really drive and the concept you need to keep in mind is you are an investor in teams that produce capabilities that your customers love, right? And I want to pull that thread, and I'm going to keep pulling that thread through this entire conversation. But when you look at this concept, you are investing in teams. You're not actually directly investing in features or capabilities in your product. you're investing in teams that can build those things, right? And we're going to kind of walk through that overall. Now, I want to start off with some core skill set items that you're going to have built into your organization, core capabilities that you need in your organization that are kind of key tests for success when we're talking to a company. These are also things that if you don't have, it's kind of the elements that you have to build at the very beginning to really get through the rest of this conversation. We break this down into a set of core capabilities, core principles, as I might call them as well. And I'm actually going to focus more on the right-hand side of this. When you say, okay, product design and development, you should be talking about this the entire time because this is a CPO conversation. But really, when we talk about the core capabilities that you need inside of your organization, it starts off with 3 basic principles. One is well-formatted and functioning teams, right? You need to have this core concept of teams locked down in your organization. In fact, there was a couple of great webinars in this series where we talk about team topologies and how you build out those teams. And so I highly recommend people go out and go back and look at this. I'll start off with a little bit of that conversation here as we go as well. You need to have a well-understood work breakdown hierarchy. This is like the most boring principle on earth, but it is one of the most key fundamental areas that you have to have built into your organization. Now I'm going to show you an example of work breakdown hierarchy, but in all reality, you just need to have a work breakdown hierarchy that the entire organization agrees to, that aligns to how you work and is well understood across the organization. And in the end, you need to have built your whole organization around principles 1 and 2. You need to have a good prospect on how that organization is built out. What is the core alignment between your leadership team and your individual teams? How do you align people to the work, to align job practices, and especially in product management and engineering, back to the work in the hierarchy? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, on the left-hand side here, yes, I am going to talk a little bit about strategy, facts, and vision. But overall, what I'm going to be really focused on is that know the facts in this conversation. How do we know what's going on in our environment? How do we make the right bets to drive ROI in our business? And how do we track that overall as a leader in the organization? So let's start off with well-formatted and functioning teams. You need to have a standard template for your teams, right? This is the way we talk to all of our organizations. Now, if you read the books on team topologies, there's a lot of great information out here about how you design teams, how you build teams, what types of teams there are. You have your product teams, you have your feature teams, you have your component teams. There's a whole bunch of different topologies out there and how you describe team design. But you need to have this well understood. You need to have, as on the CPO side, strong product representation on these teams, right? This is a core capability built into the organization about how you drive execution across the business. Now, I'm going to be using this concept of teams a lot throughout this. And as a leader on the product side, I hear a lot from people, well, I'm the product person. I don't design the teams, that's our engineering leader, that's our CTO. Well, you need to have a strong opinion about how the teams are built, how they're aligned to product, and how you drive the organizations between product and engineering, operations, and the business together to be making decisions effectively, right? And so this is key to both roles, the CPO, CTO. And by the way, part of the reason why we end up creating the CPTO role, or whatever we want to call that, the top level role across the organization, because lots of times we see the split between a CPO and a CTO around how we run an organization. So we end up bringing in somebody over the top to drive the whole organization and drive those teams back together over and over again. Right? That's kind of the core role of the CPTO when we hire that role. Well understood work breakdown hierarchy. As I said, this one's really boring, but you have to have this concept. In fact, you should have this concept plastered on the wall somewhere, wherever you're working. You should be able to draw a strong link between what is happening in your true north to your overall strategies. And we'll look at views on this as we go through. What major initiatives you're driving, what features are underneath those, and how do those connect back to the teams working on them. Now, you don't have to use stories or features or initiatives. You don't have to call them the same things, but you should be able to show this map. How do I drive all the way from the top to the bottom and connect the work from what the day-to-day individual is doing back to what we're trying to do as a company overall? This is also the foundation for a lot of different things about how we actually design our organization, how we align product managers and product owners, or we don't much call them product owners anymore, but people on the teams back to the work overall. And we'll talk a little bit about this. And on the other side, we need to have an understanding of what roles we need across the organization to support those teams as we roll them out. Now, it's not just, you know, an engineering leader and a product leader, although it might be in a very small organization. But as you scale and grow, you typically have engineering directors who manage multiple teams. You have product managers who might be aligned to teams or might be aligned across multiple teams, or they may not. They might be aligned to initiatives or something larger. But you need to have a strong understanding of how you align those teams to the work, to the people who are supporting those teams. And all of those things need to work together to drive the organizational structure that you're running, right? You're gonna see a lot of this as we kind of walk through the hard times in the organization and the hard conversations here as we move forward. So let's start this off, right? Because this is actually a really great example as you walk through this of the things you need to have on a day-to-day as a CPO and as a head of product that are really driving how you run your organization overall, right? You are, as I said, investing in teams that build great products, right? And so as an investor in those teams, right, if I'm an investor in coffee beans, right, I'm going to go out and walk the fields, understand how the coffee is grown, what the soil is like, what the different elements of the weather patterns are. And I'm going to look at the harvesting process and all these other things. As an investor in teams, I need to have that same mindset. I need to understand how my teams are constructed. Who are the great people on the teams? What's the reliability and the capabilities of those teams? What capabilities are those teams capable of delivering? It's a lot of capables, but you get the point. And then how do I understand how to grow those teams over time? And so you spend a lot of time focusing on that area of production that is the team, and making sure that you and your CTO or your head of engineering are in lockstep about how you build this organization and how you drive organizational health. That's the investment side. Now, there's the other side of the investment as well, which is understanding ROI, and we'll get down to that in just a second. But in between that is having a strong view of how the organization is planning and executing, right? How do I understand what my organization is working on? What are the best investments? And how do I then measure ROI and make the investment case for new investments? And by the way, a new investment is not an investment in a new feature. It's an investment in a new team that can build that feature, an outsourced organization that can build that feature, an investment in buying a new organization, doing M&A work to build that feature, or who has that feature, right? Build, buy, partner, right, is really what we're looking at here as your core investment cases. And so you, as a leader of that investment case, need to have a strong understanding of what your current capabilities are so you can make the decisions around the future. So let's talk, oh, I forgot to preface this. Let's talk about this from a perspective of a conversation that we're having somewhat frequently right now. I will say that across our portfolio, we invest in enterprise software. Primarily, we haven't had a ton of this conversation. I think the news media is maybe a little bit eager to show when large software companies lay people off, but for the most part, we've had only a few of these conversations. Most of our businesses are seeing some slowdowns, but it's too early to tell if we're going to be doing a lot of these organizational health and quite frankly, reduction conversations in the future. What I'll also say is that this conversation is the exact same conversation, just in the inverse. If you come to me as a CPO or head of product inside of one of our companies and say, hey, I want to hire 100 new people, it's the same as that conversation we walk through. We'll just talk about the negative case as we go forward. So first thing we talk about in working this problem, and this is what these views are. We'll actually get to the actual actions that you might take as a CPO when you're thinking about reducing your portfolio overall. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's talk about the data that we gather at the beginning of this process. These are the conversations that we have to have to really understand if we're making the right decisions in either adding people to your portfolio or reducing the portfolio overall. First is team health. Understanding how well you've built your teams across the organization, how well structured they are, how well constructed they are, and how healthy they are overall in a running state today, right? First thing we do is we take your standard team template or your multiple team templates. You might have 2 or 3 different team templates. I think, in fact, at Carbon Black, I think we had 5 standard templates based around the different types of teams we needed across our products. We take your standard team templates, we compare your teams to those, and we say, okay, what pieces are missing, right? What roles are missing from each team? How are these teams constructed? And what are we seeing as major problems across that team? There's a bunch of different frameworks for this, but the basic idea here is to understand your current assets and understand how you're going to be investing in these teams in the future. We'll kind of come back to this as we go. The other portion of this is to understand the operational coverage ratios. How do you cover the rest of the roles outside of the teams inside of your organization? Now, I'm not going to go into each and every one of these. There's a lot of detail here. This is something that we deep dive into with our organizations. But the basic idea is, for some number of teams, you should have an engineering director or an engineering VP, right? For some number of teams, you should have some core operations or operations capabilities. Think of this as DevOps or SRE operations capabilities aligned to the number of teams. For some number of teams, you should have product management and product management leaders aligned to those teams, right? These are ratios that we're looking at. Product operations as well, UX, user learning. These are all roles that may or may not sit inside of your teams that need to be aligned to the ratio of teams inside of the organization. We look at this as investors to look for waste, right? We look at this to understand whether or not we've got a whole bunch of different roles out there that have been kind of stranded on the side, not functioning inside of the teams. We look for opportunity here to help guide the organizations on how they can be more efficient and how they build and construct their teams and their organization that's supporting those teams, right? This is also something that, by the way, you as a CPO, when you're looking at your overall expense to revenue ratio of your organization, right? This is one of the core portfolio items that you're going to be tracking as on the finance side. When I look at my expense to revenue ratio, I can guarantee you my CFO is looking at this, right? What is expense to revenue ratio? It's the cost of the overall R&D organization versus revenue of the organization overall. And typically, this number, we've got a whole blog on this on our blog at insightpartners.com. We walk through what are the standard ratios we see across the organization. Typically, your CFO thinks this number is a lot lower than it is. But for a grown organization, something like an organization in the $100 million ARR range, it's usually about 35%. 35% of R&D is spent on, 35% of revenue is spent on R&D, right? And so you need to be able to understand this ratio, understand where you have waste, because I guarantee you, as you're talking to your investors, to your CFO, and to people outside of the organization, we are looking at this one simple ratio to understand how you're investing and how you're spending in R&D, right? So don't overspend, right? On the other side of that, don't underspend, because if you're underspending, we also see that you're not managing the portfolio, you're not making big bets, and so forth. We see a lot of organizations, by the way, here, where they've done M&A, they've acquired other teams, they've merged with other companies as they've grown, where there's a ton of inefficiency here. So as a CPO, should be looking at the inefficiencies here and saying, look, is it worth these roles that we have? Or is it another team that we can add the organization that can actually be producing capabilities that have value to our customers that drive ROI across the business? You have to be maniacally focused on your one primary portfolio item that you can control, which is headcount, right? Another thing we look at when we look at these teams and we look at the capabilities of the organization to deliver is say-do ratio, right? Now, I always love metrics that drive a ton of behavior across the whole organization. This is kind of a trailing metric a lagging indicator that essentially tells us how reliable the organization is at delivering their functionality quarter over quarter. The one I like to look at are features at the quarterly on a quarterly basis, right? Now, you may not have a feature, you may have a component or some other thing that you call it, whatever that middle level object is that teams deliver. I want to know that on a quarterly basis, we can choose to say, we're going to do this number of these things. And at the end of that, we can measure and say, okay, we did this number of these things. All right. Typically, we call them features nowadays, but there's all kinds of different perspectives on this. If you're doing something like shape up method, then great. Show me your say-do ratio inside of a 6 or 8 week period, whatever your standard shape up period is. If you're doing a safe or scaled agile framework, great. Show me your quarterly PSI metrics and show me your say-do ratio. I use this as an understanding of how I'm going to handicap my investments across the portfolio, and how I'm going to kind of think about your team from a health perspective. Because if this number is too low, I know that the teams aren't necessarily healthy or reliable. If this number is too high, I'm probably thinking that the metrics either not valid or the teams are sandbagging. I'm looking for something in that 80 to 90% range, showing me that the organization is able to be reliable in their commitments and continue to scale along with those commitments. Now, I ask the question probably 5 or 6 times a day, show me your roadmap. Right? It's either in the diligence process, or it's our advising process, or it's in, sometimes it's in the hiring process as well. And this is typically what I see. Now, this is a great roadmap when you're talking to your customers, showing what you have in progress, what you were working on, and what you've delivered. Typically at the feature level, for most people, we do these roadmaps. We used to do these as 3-quarter rolling roadmaps, but then when we put the quarters in, it showed a little too much commitment and it changed the conversation with the customer. So it was better to just say in progress, under consideration, and delivered. On the other hand, this roadmap's nowhere near enough for the conversation we need to have, right? These are customer-facing roadmaps that give them the visuals they need to understand what's going on, but it really doesn't give us an understanding of how we're going to deliver these things, how they're going to get through the teams, how the investment is going to work out. It is really only the basics of what's needed. So let's talk about what we dig into, what we're asking for when we're going into these hard conversations around how we're going to change the organization. First off, I need to be able to see a team-by-team quarterly roadmap that shows me what features they're going to be working on or what objects they're going to be working on at this point in a shorter period of time than a 2-year or a 3-quarter roadmap, right? I want to see what your next quarter looks like. I want to see how you're stacking the teams, how they align to the work, and how they're going to be executing on this in some form of time period, whether it be sprints or the different periods for shape-up method or whatever your cadence mechanism is. I want to be able to see the teams and how they're assigned to work, how they're working on that, and how they're delivering those items on a quarterly or smaller time box period. I want to be able to see how that work on those teams aligns to something larger. I use the term initiative. I don't care what you call this thing. It might be a project. It might be, an epic. It might be whatever you want to call it. But I want to be able to see that the teams are aligned back to some larger element of value that is driving ROI across the business. Now, features can drive ROI, but features are ephemeral in a much shorter term, right? They tend to come and go in maybe a quarterly basis or maybe half-yearly basis, something small, right? And features aren't something that should live for forever either, right? Even in a product-led business where we're doing a lot of testing and customer testing on features, we want to eventually close that feature and say, we're done. We've achieved the goal of the customer and we need to move on. So I need something larger. I need to be able to tie ROI to something that ties back to our strategy as a business. And so I need that interim object. I also need to be able to align my organization around something more than features, right? And that might be around products that we're building. It might be about around an alignment around, and I'm being very ambiguous here because I don't want to dictate a structure. What I want to give is the basic concept of each level, and really walk through why these levels are important, not necessarily the structure in each level. It might be that you're aligned to OKRs, and these are some higher level objectives, or you're actually taking the key results and breaking them out and calling them initiatives or something along those lines. There's a lot of different ways to break this down and to drive a system like this, right? But you need to have this level that really is showing where we're placing our bets, and it needs to be something that your executive team can understand, that they can make trade-offs on, and you can drive the conversation up a level here to this initiative level. Because if you have, as a head of product or as a CPO, if you have your chief revenue officer, your head of finance, your CEO all digging in at the feature level, you've kind of lost at this game. You need to pull them up to this initiative level. And when we're having this conversation around the future of the organization, I need to have it at an initiative level as well, because I'm an advisor. I can't really understand your feature level roadmap perfectly. I'm not a customer. I don't know your business. So we need to be talking about the ROI of your investments and how that's driving things at the team level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. I need to be able to see a map of how something at the top connects to your ROI investments on the right? So it's true north. This is an example of a true north to company strategy, to product strategy, to initiative. Most likely, you're not going to have this many levels unless you're a 100 million plus company that is building out a multi-product portfolio or something along those lines, right? On the other hand, it would be great if you had a true north and at least some level of product strategies that are tied to initiatives. Or in the end, you might have OKRs in the middle here that are tied to initiatives. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. But being able to show this connection shows me that you understand that you've built out and aligned your overall initiatives back to your product strategy, back to your company true north, and that you've had these conversations with the executive team around how we're going to drive the company strategy overall based on the product. You also need to be able to show me how you are doing the rest of the work. By the way, not everything is aligned to initiatives. In fact, a good portion of most people's roadmaps isn't, right? Good portion of those roadmaps are aligned to, production support, bugs. You've got maintenance work or architectural roadmap. You've got, all of the other items that you've just got to take care of on a regular basis. And in fact, most teams, when you talk about actual feature development on the product roadmap that are aligned to initiatives, typically run in that 40 to 70% of their roadmap are driven by those initiative aligned items, right? World class is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65%. Typical is actually in the area of about 45% when we look at how much of the roadmap is actually driven by all of the roadmap that people see on a daily basis. You also need to be able to show me how much of your teams, how much of your work is aligned by each initiative. Because if you show me a major initiative on the roadmap that's actually only got 5% of the team allocation month over month, quarter over quarter, I'm not going to believe you, right? And we need to be able to walk through this and understand exactly how much you're allocating to each initiative overall. This is really important because when we get through this, we actually are then walking through this in the backwards direction on how we actually reduce the organization overall. And in the end of this, when we talk about this, one of the best views is how do I see the decision-making process around ROI in my organization in a simple set of views. This is my favorite, although there's multiple views on this. And in fact, when you look at this view, this is really kind of a decision-making view as well, based on where the initiative sits in the timeline and where it sits in priority. It does actually give you a basic idea of what our decisioning priority is here. But when we look at a Kanban view of our initiatives, right? This gives us a basic understanding of what are we analyzing, what are the initiatives that we're assessing, what's the top of our initiative backlog, what's currently in progress, what are we working on, and how far are we along with this, along with what do we believe the business value is in some form. And then what have we completed, and how are we tracking and measuring our achievement towards that ROI target overall since the launch of that initiative, or the features underneath that initiative. All right. This is a very simple view, but this is something that I will say that 90% of my CPOs, heads of products, don't have, right? And this is where, when we break this down, as I said before, I love views that drive a ton of behavior in the organization. This is driving a ton of product management behavior behind the scenes, right? You have to have the ability to understand the ROI of your investment. You have to have an understanding of the size of the initiative and the cost of the features underneath it. You have to have a system for doing a business value assessment for each initiative and understanding the weight of the job. If you're doing weighted shortest job or something along those lines for a business value or ROI calculation perspective. You have to have a strong conversation with your leadership team around the prioritization of these major initiatives across the board. You have to have a system in place for tracking ROI once you consider an initiative to be done or a set of features to be done, and understand how you actually delivered on that item, right? There's a ton of behavior behind the scenes that is driven into the product management organization and across the R&D organization to make something like this possible. And you really have to have this kind of locked down as a part of your system for driving the organization, right? This isn't possible unless your system includes all of the different aspects that we've talked about. You have to have well-organized teams. You have to have some form of work breakdown hierarchy that is important, right? You have to have a leadership team that's aligned to how we work, how the teams work, and the work itself, right? We have to have all of the different views around how we manage our portfolio and how we invest in teams. We need to have a strong concept of how we build and rebuild those teams and drive team health inside of the organization. And you, as the primary investor, the person who is managing this portfolio, need to have an understanding of all of those different things across the board so that you're placing your bets in the right way, aligned with what are our current capabilities of the organization and what is the ability for us to deliver on those our goals overall. So let's take this to the negative side. Let's take this to what a lot of us are doing as investors right now in our own portfolios, right? How do I shape my portfolio? How do I shape my investments to match the market as it is today, right? There's a lot of companies making minor moves here in shaping their portfolios, maybe doing minor cuts to their organization, looking for roles that don't make sense inside of the organization, ratios that are off for specific roles. There's a lot of people doing that right now, right? And I hate the term trimming the fat. That's not really what we're doing. It's not necessarily around the lowest performers. It's really looking at your organization and saying, what's the right design for this organization? What are the right roles to support that design? And then how do we get that team to be lean and mean to really drive ROI across the business? So let's talk about this conversation. This is something that my team gets brought in on, and we walk through everything that we just walked through first before we actually start the conversation around what's the plan, what are we going to do? And by the way, as I said earlier, I love this conversation more when it's on the other side, when we're talking about adding 10 teams to the organization and how are we going to do that, right? But this is the market that we're in today. So first of all, we look to reduce down the number of teams quite simply by saying, okay, what's your current team health? Look, you've got a bunch of different gaps in all of these teams. Let's take this one team on the end here that is fully staffed. Let's actually break that up. Let's fill all of the gaps on the other teams to make sure that they are whole and healthy teams first, right? Then we might do some performance evaluation of people across the teams and look at where we might not have some team members who are really making it. And we would maybe then reduce another team in this organization and backfill roles that we might move out of the organization across the board based on performance. I don't like this topic too much, but it is a part of this process, right? We are looking for low performers and backfilling them by maybe breaking up another team and taking those members and moving them over to other teams, right? And then really the focus being on full teams overall. Then we might reduce another team, right? If we have to, if we're looking at shaping the portfolio extremely, right? The first steps are to break up teams and backfill the previous teams. The second step would be to look at performance and make sure that we backfill those roles with existing team members, getting to the point where we have these full teams overall, and then realigning support roles across the organization to look for efficiency on the non-team member roles across the org, right? And there's a lot of that as well. So this is something that we look at first when doing this, shaping down the organization. But we need to actually understand the consequences of this, because this is just a team. I don't actually know what this team is working on per se. And so we need to be able to have this view of what are the teams working on and what are we going to lose? What is the trade-off we're making in the ROI delivered to the customer based on the reduction in teams, right? You need to have this system in place to be able to see this, because if we're scrambling to do this at the last minute while we're trying to change the teams, we're going to make bad decisions, right? So this is something that needs to have been built into the organization over time to be able to make these decisions in good times and in bad. But we need to be able to see those trade-offs and say, okay, if I'm losing this team, that means this initiative is at risk, means this ROI is shifting. And by the way, our whole roadmap needs to shift around to be able to understand this, right? Which means we'll go back to these teams and say, okay, well, maybe how about this team? What happens if we do this team? We're doing a ton of scenario planning between these two views and understanding how do I lay out the work and how do I make the right trade-offs and drive efficiency in ROI without reducing ROI and capabilities for our customers overall. In the end, I need to be also able to make the decision around how am I moving things around on our Kanban, and the loss in business value that I am reaping from the gain in savings and team investment, right? And so I need to be able to make that trade-off, bring that to the executive team, show those trade-offs, and have that argument across the leadership team around how are we going to change our roadmap, how are we going to change the unit economics of our products, and what is the impact going to be based on the scenarios that we're laying out. This is a very simple version of this, but this is really easy. It's the hardest easy conversation you'll ever have if you have all of the different other capabilities in place. You understand your teams, you understand how your work is laid out, you have all of the different systems in place to be able to see how those teams are delivering on ROI. It's actually a relatively easy conversation to have around the trade-offs here if you have all of those different things in place. On the other hand, I get to see CPOs and heads of product struggle at this for months when they don't have these systems in place because they don't have the visibility to make these decisions. And so they really end up doing more of a thumb in the wind kind of calculation about how they're going to reduce teams. And hardly ever does it work out well when you see these things happen in those environments, right? Now, here's the hard part, right? As that investor in coffee, as I said before, as you get better and better at this, you start to understand that, the different soil profiles, you understand the different weather patterns, you understand the different regional varieties, understand the differences in the picking process. Well, you get to be a kind of a connoisseur of teams as part of your investment strategy as a chief product officer. And so you also then have to work well with your head of engineering or your CTO to really drive how you're doing these reductions in a more effective way, right? In fact, I learned more about hiring freezes and natural attrition from my CFO than I've ever really learned on the job, because what we did was we sat down and said, look, we need to reduce over time this investment. What are we going to do, right? And my CFO at the time was kind of somebody who had done this for a while and had been bitten by doing reductions in force, either big ones or small ones. And so his perspective was, all right, let's just freeze the higher headcount. Let's let natural attrition, which typically is about 10 to 15% inside of non-Silicon Valley engineering organizations. Let's let natural attrition take its place over the year, and that will result in about a 15% reduction in the organization throughout the year, right? We mapped that out over a multi-year plan, and we were able to actually hit our goals on the ROI of that product over a 3-year period, just using natural attrition and hiring freeze, right? So this is something that you have to have all of these different views to understand, and you have to have a system in place to really drive. And that allows you to be a leader who is shaping the organization, not cutting the organization, right? There's also the elements of reskilling people, moving them between roles. I would say hiring freezes and no backfills are kind of the same thing, but they're a little different, as in no backfills is a hiring freeze with we're also not backfilling people on those teams as well. And in the end, yes, you can do reductions in force, but that should be your last option, because you should have the visibility across your system to be able to see what can we do for each one of our investment areas? How can we make the right changes in the organization to drive the investment over time from a cost perspective, and kind of avoid deep rifts and light rifts as much as possible. And that's where your system really pays off. When you're making these really hard decisions around people, being able to see what is going on across your organization and make those right decisions based on the data is night and day when it comes to making these changes in your organization, and night and day as a leader who has to make those tough calls, right? So with that, I'll say thank you. And I think we'll open it up for questions from folks. I think we had some example questions here, but I'd love to hear questions off the line.
Yeah, so this is amazing. We already have a ton of the audience question. Maybe we take some of the live audience question, and then we come back to some of the previously asked question. What do you think?
Great, that's perfect.
So, wow, this is a lot. And I've seen a ton of the questions from audience, and also through working with a lot of CPOs. I think sometimes the people forget, when you're product managers, you work with the team, you don't think about as much around sort of the roles and jobs and investment. Once you get into the CPO, not only you work with your own product organization, the decision you make affect a much broader scope, right? Think about the engineerings and sources, all these people's job, and in many ways affected very much by decisions on the product side. So I'll take on some of the questions here. So when you mentioned about sort of like really tied to the first question was what are some of the roadblocks that keep CPO, especially new CPOs, from making the shift from a product building to company and team organizational building sort of mindset?
Yeah. Well, so the first roadblock is actually the same thing as on the engineering side. So we've said for a very long time on the engineering side, but this happens completely on the product side as well. And don't take this the wrong way, CPOs and heads of product, but we are all promoted to the highest level of incompetence, right? On the engineering side, we said, we promote engineers who are great engineers to lead engineers, and they do relatively well with that. Then we promote them to engineering directors, and they typically struggle because their skill set is building products, not managing people, right? On the product side is the same basic thing. Our core skill set as product managers at the beginning is building products that our customers love, right? And it's that whole cycle of how do we work directly with customers to drive ROI at that micro level, right? But what we really don't get a lot of is, and then we get promoted and we're a director of product and we're managing multiple other product managers who are probably, or I'm probably running a product line at a higher level. And then suddenly I'm running, a full product or multiple products as a VP of product or head of product. The key there is that we typically stay with our focus on customer value at that micro level. And we don't get a lot of exposure to a lot of the portfolio management techniques that you would really need as an investor, right? And so you have to go out there and kind of beat up your skill set and say, okay, what am I missing? I actually went out as a part of my career and got a master's in finance because I was like, all right, I need to understand the concepts around ROI to a level that I can compete with my CFO, my CEO, and really drive the business as an investor, right? And that was part of my career journey. But for your career journey might be to go out and learn, a lot of these portfolio management techniques and learn from the rest of us around how can I, drive the decisions being made inside of my company. Another element is, and we'll answer other questions here quickly. So I'm going to be more terse on this, but is really the right to do so, right? You have to earn the right to be the person managing the portfolio. You need to be the person who steps back from the product decisions and can look at this portfolio in an objective way and bring that to your CRO, your CEO, your CFO, and be that objective person on their team that is making decisions around ROI, not somebody who loves the product so much that you can't make those decisions effectively, right? And so that is a major step in that career as well, is being that objective investor, stepping back from the product and saying, no, I'm the person who has to make the hard decisions and the hard cuts, both from a people perspective and from a product perspective.
Right.
So.
Right. I totally hear you. I think it's interesting that through interacting with a lot of CPOs and some of the aspiring ones, you hear more talk about the customer experience, the onboarding, the adoption. When you talk to more seasoned CPOs, they're really talking about the ROIs and really think about how not only is the product that customer loves to use, how does it drive business, and what is the conversion rate of that? What each of the conversion rate change would do that? How does the opportunity cost? Because I can do A or B, they both are good. The only way to say where give me more bang for the buck and for today or for the future. So that's a really, really cool reminder to say, hey, CPO as investors. Investors. Right?
I gave a very simple version of an ROI framework in that Kanban, but that is the most simple version you could ever think of, right? As a CPO, you need to have your favorite, this is the nerdiest thing ever, right? But you need to have your favorite business value framework that you use to drive, those conversations. And so you need to be able to discuss that in length and be able to really drive that framework as part of the decision-making process inside of your business.
Right. I think that one of the things I want to, it's also audience question, is that how do you get product managers to onboard with the mindset of an ROI? Because, obviously CPOs, you get your master degrees, right? And, you get to talk to CFO. From product manager perspective, they get pulling all over the place, get fired to all the time. Also, they are taught to do user stories and experiences, and there was ROI wasn't very much of the conversation, and everything also has the ROI. What's your kind of observation on that kind of get a team along on the same boat?
Yeah, exactly. Two sides, front and back, right? One is the shared view of the goals of the things they're working on. So typically, when you have more junior product managers, they work at that feature level or that story level, the team level overall, right? But I always want to make sure that they can see the overall view of the larger initiatives that they're working on and that they're impacting, and that they're constantly in that conversation with the more senior product managers who are owning initiatives and driving the business value across the business. And so I'm looking to bring those more junior product managers into the larger conversations around the initiative and how we drive value, so that they understand when they're building their features that it's not just about how the customer perceives the feature and how the customer uses the feature, but what is the end impact on our overall KPIs across the business, right? And so driving them in that conversation. On the other side of that, I like to involve them in designing the systems for how we're going to measure those KPIs, both at a tracking level, but also as they're running their experiments with customers. How do we track that day-to-day customer data back to the core KPIs of the business? And how do we show the contribution of their features to those the improvements in those KPIs, right? And so I really do put that burden on those teams and on those lower level product managers to connect back those business results on the execution side once a feature is launched and while we're tracking the work and so forth. And so that starts that process, starts to get them into that investor mindset. But then as they grow through their careers and they become product managers, I ask them to own initiatives and drive the ROI of those initiatives. And then as they become a product line director or somebody above a product manager, I'm asking them to prioritize those initiatives and make the smaller portfolio decisions at a product by product or area of the product level. And so trying to build that chain as a leader to kind of bake the learning about ROI into each one of the roles as they move up the chain.
Right. So you mentioned a few times about systems. Definitely the diagrams and charts, it can look pretty daunting, especially for some of the folks. Either they're not thinking that way, or they're kind of going along with the existing teams and structure. So how did you go about implement a system?
Well, so unfortunately, for multiple years, even being somebody who owned a former PPM product, I will say that a lot of these things have been missing from the market. So I will give a shameless plug on the Dragonboat side here from the perspective of we invested because we believe Dragonboat helps you solve these problems, right? Dragonboat's capabilities are amazing from the perspective of being able to actually help you build this system into the product and be able to manage your work overall. Now, I have done this for years with spreadsheets and with Google Docs and Google Slides. And what I'll say is, A, you need to sit down and build your system, think about your system, come up with this concept, and then let a product like Dragonboat help you kind of morph into the standards that other people are using, so that you are kind of following a standard framework for how to do this, and you can learn from the other people around you who are doing this in a product like Dragonboat, and really drive towards kind of using some of those standards in these products to help you build your system as well. So do it at the same time. I used to say build your entire system on a whiteboard and then just then whatever tool you have, it has to match what you're doing there. Well, that doesn't really work either. Do it in synchronous, build both systems at the same time, build it in Dragonboat, build it on your whiteboard, and match the ideal to what is the standard, and continue to build from there.
Right. It's very interesting, Ryan. And thank you for for sharing that, and definitely thank you for being on our board and supporting us from the very beginning. And that is true that we also noticed that even though every business is unique, there are themes, there are categories, there are patterns, and that's really how we built into our tool. And we're really passionate about this, helping product team be successful in a way so that you can, like, as you whiteboard it, you have a baseline template to start with. I think that's really the things that we're really passionate about as well. One of the things that you being a CPO for many years and run product for many years, what is the I'm just gonna do a closing question. What do you see differentiate a good enough, a pretty good CPO to like a really great CPO, and what are the differences, and how do you see they can get from one to the exceptionally good one?
Well, so I typically see, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but not enough, and that is, I typically see, I'll go a little bit of a different direction on this one, but I'll come back around to the question here really quick, is that a really great head of product is a highly facilitative leader who brings systems into place to allow the leadership team to get visibility to make decisions. That's a really great head of product. That is somebody who understands that they don't necessarily own the decisions, but the more they can bring data to the leadership team and bring the right views to the leadership team to make trade-offs, the more they can control those decisions in the right way. right? And they're, I'll say it, master manipulators from a perspective of, for the most part, founders don't really know a lot of these techniques either, right? Your CEO, your CTO, the founders of your business, if you're coming into a mid-sized startup, don't have these techniques either. So you need to bring this in and teach people how to make the right decisions, right? And in the end, a really great CPO doesn't lose that mindset, right? They maintain that facilitative mindset. They focus on the system and they put the system in place to make decisions. It might just be that they're making more of the decisions themselves instead of having to, get the whole leadership team to make it. But by the way, the really great CPOs, the whole leadership team feels like they were a part of making that decision, right? Because your head of sales, your CRO, your head of finance, your CFO, your CEO, all of these folks need to believe in the roadmap that you've created, the investments that you're making. And so the ability to bring them along as part of that process and to get that element of belief, don't lose that from being a great head of product. Carry that forward into the process of being a great CPO.
This is a really amazing insight, especially around how the role, there's a switch, but there's such a graduation, carry things over. So I think we're all out of time today. It was very, very insightful to hear from you. There are more resources if you like to get. So if you want to get more recordings of the session, a previous session of a CPOs, or learn how a product operating system, which Ryan mentioned a lot of, the right system, facilitate the information for the right decision, and check out Dragonboat.io/CPO. Thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to speak to you soon again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.